All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm hearing amplification, so I guess this mic is on. Big shout out to the tech crew. Thanks, guys. I say that as a former theater major. No, it's true. So we have an awesome panel here for you, and I think we're going to do a good job of keeping you from that postprandial coma that we're all kind of familiar with. I'd like to introduce from my left, your far right, Professor Carolyn Ramsey from University of Colorado, who will be talking about firearms in the family, and Professor Mary Fan from the University of Washington, talking about preventing ordinary and extraordinary violence. I think you may have met Professor Stover already, who will be talking about politics, firearms, and family violence. And then sitting next to me is Professor Goodmark from the University of Maryland, who is going to be talking about militarized masculinity, and as well as law enforcement. And we're going to do our best to keep things on track, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
My name is Lee Goodmark. I'm the director of the Gender Violence Clinic at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, and the piece that I want to talk about today, called Hands Up at Home, is about law enforcement officer intimate partner violence. And I'm only going to give you a very short part of that piece today because I am a rule follower and I have 11 minutes. But I do want to situate it in the context of my work, which is all about that critique of criminalization that you've been hearing about all day. And so, you know, there are lots of dimensions upon which people have critiqued the criminalization of domestic violence. But I think that this may be the first one that talks about the real problem that we have with law enforcement and law enforcement intimate partner violence and how that complicates this idea of criminalization. So in terms of thinking about the politicization, which I can't really say, of safety, I think that the decision to make law enforcement the primary response to intimate partner violence is a political decision on 3 dimensions. So first, it's part of that larger decision that we've talked about, you know, ad nauseum today, to make criminalization the primary response to domestic violence in the United States. And since Mimi's timeline has become kind of a touch point for all of us today, I want to add a date to that timeline, which is 1984. In 1984, the Attorney General's Task Force on Family Violence for the first time says, domestic violence is a criminal justice problem. It requires a criminal justice solution. And that's really, I think, the moment from which we track criminalization. That moment at the same time as the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment is happening, but that's when we really start to walk down the path towards criminalization. VAWA, as you know, really kind of hypes up or ramps up that effort, allocates hundreds of millions of dollars to the crime response. VAWA has allocated $5.7 billion into violence against women's services since its inception, but what you may not know is that 62% of that went to the criminal legal system in 1994. By 2013, it was 85%. So when we talk about VAWA as primarily a criminal legal system strategy, it is not an overstatement. Right? This is really where the bulk of the funding is going. You know already it was part of the Omnibus Crime Act of 1994. That was not a mistake. And it's part of this larger system of governing through crime that Jonathan Simon talks about, where we put all of our resources into the criminal legal system and assume that that's the place where we do our best social work. The criminal legal system is now the primary response to intimate partner violence in the United States, and for my purposes, why that matters is that's what makes the police the most important piece, really, in this entire puzzle. They are an integral part of this system. There's nobody really who gets focused on more than that frontline law enforcement in VAWA. So thinking about the ways in which VAWA funds are allocated, a lot of the money requires collaboration. And it's collaboration with the legal system, but most of that money is going into police departments. So to the extent that we're building the nonprofit industrial complex of police and domestic violence service agencies, a lot of that is coming from VAWA. So that's the first dimension upon which we see this problem of politicization of safety. The second dimension is in the decision to support and to grow what is a hyper-masculine environment. So I don't think I'll shock any of you by saying that policing is a masculine institution, and notwithstanding the efforts that have been made in recent years to bring more women into police agencies, policing is a male environment. And if you look at studies of police institutions, you see really hyper-masculine kinds of attitudes about women and towards other men within those institutions. And policing is part of kind of what some have called hegemonic masculinity, this kind of idealized masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity requires differentiation from that which is feminine, right? To be the uber man, to be the ultimate man, the most important thing you have to do is to distance yourself from the feminine. And so one of the ways that you can do that is to use violence. And using violence reinforces that separation from that which is feminine. Militarized masculinity, which is the particular kind of masculinity that I talk about in my paper, is an ideology that stresses aggressiveness and the use of force and the glorification of military power. And militarized masculinity and hegemonic or hypermasculinity really go hand in hand, and they create a climate within which violence against women really flourishes. In the United States, we've started to blur the line between policing and the military quite significantly. So if you look at police agencies now, when they do special task force things, they take names in the same way that, say, Operation Desert Storm or other kinds of military, what do they call those military, Donna, what's the word I want? Operations. Other military operations have names. So we have overlap in personnel. We have a strictly hierarchical structure in which you're supposed to report your way up the chain. A military structure, dress, cops often dress as though they're in the military, and they use very similar kinds of weaponry now. So in addition to taking on the ideology of militarization, they're taking on the trappings of militarization as well. And they've been aided in this by something called the Excess Property or 1033 program. So if you saw the images of tanks rolling through Ferguson, Missouri after Michael Brown's death, those tanks were there in large part because of the 1033 program. What the 1033 program does is to take excess Department of Defense weaponry and make it available to local law enforcement. So it creates absurdities, like the fact that the University of South Florida has a tank for its campus police force. I can't imagine what the University of South Florida needs a tank for, but what that does to that police force is say, you're more than just a community-based organization designed with protecting the public safety. You are part of a military campaign, and you should approach the people that you police in that way. All right, so all of those things lead to a greater militarization of the police force, and this is what we've invested, right, with the responsibility of being the frontline responders to intimate partner violence. This is who we're sending out to be the first people often at a scene of intimate partner violence. And that leads us to the third dimension upon which this decision is politicized, and that's the decision not to interrogate the link between policing and intimate partner violence. For more than 20 years, we have had studies that suggest that intimate partner violence occurs in greater rates in police families than in other families and is committed at in greater numbers by police officers than by other people. Some studies put the number at twice to 4 times as likely. The studies are flawed, and they are old, but they are flawed in ways that make it more likely that they're underreporting, not that they're overreporting, because what they rely upon is police officers to self-report. And that self-reporting has grave consequences. If you're a cop and you're admitting to crimes, in some places, that might get you fired, not all. But it's also become more problematic since the passage of the Lautenberg Amendment, which we're going to hear more about from Professor Ramsey, because now there's a real incentive not to ever report that you've committed intimate partner violence because you could lose your gun, right? So the ways in which the studies are flawed makes it likely that we're seeing underreporting as opposed to overreporting. And anecdotal evidence supports this idea that there's a significant amount of intimate partner violence within police families. In the Department of Justice's gender-biased policing report, Department of Justice's report about the Puerto Rico Police Department, which included a significant piece on gender-biased policing, the numbers of police officers in the Puerto Rico police force who were using violence were ridiculously high. Officers who had committed violence twice and 3 times against their partners had never been disciplined in any way. And so we know from those reports, as well as from some of the evidence from Baltimore, actually, that the numbers are actually quite high. It won't surprise you to hear that one of the officers who was arrested in the Freddie Gray case had also had 2 domestic violence protective orders out against him, something I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So both the studies and the anecdotal evidence tell us we know there's a significant problem among police officers with intimate partner violence. And we also know that there's an overlap between the excessive use of force and officers who are using intimate partner violence. Stinson and Lederbach did a study where they looked at officers who had been cited for the excessive use of force and found huge overlap between those officers and officers who were using intimate partner violence. This, for me, raises larger issues about the way that we look at intimate partner violence, which are not necessarily exactly germane to this, but calls into question the narrative that we've always had about domestic violence being about power and control over one's intimate partner, and suggests that, in fact, we might be dealing with really toxic kinds of masculinity that give people the entitlement to use violence in lots of different domains across lots of different kinds of relationships. And certainly policing is a place where we see that. So the environment of militarized masculinity within the police force fosters a culture that is disdainful of women at best and abusive at worst. It's not at all surprising that you would see really high rates of intimate partner violence within that environment. So, what do we do about that? Some people would say training. I don't. I don't think any more training is what anyone needs. VAWA has been funding training for years. It doesn't seem to be doing us any good. Some people would say a policy, and I think that's not a bad idea. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has a model intimate partner violence policy. There are very few policing organizations that actually have such a policy or follow it if they have it. That might be helpful. But I think what we really have to do is to call into question the effectiveness of criminalization as a strategy if what we're doing is asking those who are committing the crime to police the crime. I don't think that criminalization can be an effective strategy for dealing with intimate partner violence when those people are the same.
All right, that was incredible, Lee. Thank you. And I'm going to be presenting some work that I've just started research in this area more so, playing politics with firearms and family violence. Now, the gun lobby argues firearms don't kill people, people kill people. But survivors of domestic violence, however, will tell you they fear both the abuser and the abuser's access to firearms. And indeed, multiple studies have shown that abusers' access to firearms is strongly associated with intimate partner femicide, and there's research showing domestic abusers are approximately 5 times more likely to murder their intimate partners when they have access to guns. But family violence fatalities don't have to be accepted as an American way of life. Many of these could actually be prevented through common sense gun laws, such as requiring background checks, which have been proven to reduce domestic violence gun murders by 46%. But unfortunately, safety as related to firearms and family violence has become highly politicized, with the National Rifle Association, one of the most politically powerful advocacy groups in the United States, funding political campaigns and lobbying without regard to this data on public health and safety. As we consider what gun laws could look like if politicians resolved to stop playing politics with firearms and family violence, I want to place this in the context of the highly gendered nature of intimate partner violence, firearm ownership, and then the advocacy in terms of the firearms debates. So I don't need to tell this group that family violence, intimate partner violence is often highly gendered and that the home remains the most dangerous place in the world for a woman. And rather than a gun in the home increasing the household safety, a domestic abuser is actually likely to use the firearm to perpetrate abuse. There's a well-known study that was done here in California of abuse survivors, so people who were not killed, but of abuse survivors, that found that in nearly 3/4 of those abused women's households that had contained a gun, the abuser had either threatened to shoot and kill the survivor or had actually shot at her. And intimate partners with guns present the greatest fatal risk to women. And we know that childhood fatalities are all too often also tragedies that occur here in the United States. In terms of the gendered nature of ownership, the majority of gun owners are white men. Among heterosexual married couples, husbands are 4 to 5 times more likely to own a gun than their wives, and guns are typically viewed by all family members as the private property of a single family member, most often the man. Bless you. And furthermore, in homes with firearms, 80% of men and women report that storing the guns is solely the man's responsibility. There's also a very highly gendered knowledge gap that research has found in terms of household gun ownership, where men commonly fail to disclose that there is even a gun in the house, and if if this is all in heterosexual couples, it's been studied, but wives often are unaware of the number of guns, where men in the same households are reporting much higher volumes of guns when the wives are aware that there are guns in the home. From a masculinity theory perspective, we can explore connections between dominant modes of masculinity and violence, and how socially endorsed and normative ideals of male behavior legitimize male dominion over women and over other men. In masculinity that emphasizes dominance and control valorizes violence as a way of proving self-worth and positions women and LGBT individuals as inferior. And of course, a recent example of dominance masculinity is Omar Mateen, being the mass murderer who killed 49 people and wounded 53 others in the shooting at Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. And he had a history of perpetrating domestic violence and frequently expressed very homophobic views. And we see our gun lobby to promote gun use using gendered images of masculinity, including frontier masculinity, showing handguns as props for performing masculinity, putting men in the protector role, able to overtake any threats posed by other men. Researchers have established that white men who feel marginalized by gains made by women and by African Americans during recent decades are particularly drawn to these frontier masculinity portrayals, and that racial prejudice interacts with aggressive attitudes to produce higher levels of gun ownership. There's also political sales, with the gun industry using political moments to provoke fear and to time gun sales to the political process. So we saw a very much increased demand for ammunition leading up to the 2016 presidential election. And during Obama's presidency, the gun industry more than doubling production due to fear of restrictions that could come into place if we had another Democrat in office. Now, the NRA, seeing this large gender gap in ownership, has attempted to market and target women, but the market for guns is still mostly male. In terms of some teen dating violence implications, although youth under age 18 are generally prohibited from owning firearms and possessing handguns, males routinely have access to firearms, where approximately 1 in 16 high school students in the US reports having carried a gun in the past 30 days, and 22% of youth reporting firearm possession say they own highly lethal, rapid-fire, large-clip, automatic or semi-automatic weapons. And we also see that teen dating violence is highly associated with firearm possession. And so the third category I put up in terms of the gender nature of advocacy. This also, I'm broad stroke speaking in terms of some generalizations, right? The general gendered nature of advocacy is that women are more likely than men to support gun control, and we see that various groups have taken on the nation's 30,000 annual firearms deaths that we have here in the United States, and this advocacy is often gendered. So we saw the Million Mom March occurring in the wake of the Columbine shooting back in 1999, and then following the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America formed, modeling itself after Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the pioneering grassroots movement of the 1980s that battled cultural resignation about alcohol-related automobile deaths. Moms Demand Action uses their identities as mothers to suggest really the moral authority calling for gun control measures under this mantle of motherhood. And MDA lobbied for Facebook to prohibit private sales, unlicensed sales on its platform, and has done a lot of advocacy work in terms of Target, Starbucks, other organizations, and other places where, when states had the laws that you can open carry weapons, we saw many of the open carry groups meeting at Starbucks and having Starbucks appreciation days, and then the mothers organizing skip Starbucks Saturdays instead in counter-protest. And we see that open carry groups, in turn, making the mom's gender the target of their threats and attacks, describing MDA members as thugs with jugs and as mad moms. And in our nation's recent history, we've, of course, had many mass shootings by individuals with histories of committing domestic violence and school shootings perpetrated almost entirely by middle-class white men, along with all the intimate fatalities that I mentioned. Yet the gun lobby has resisted reforms favored even by the majority of NRA members. So in terms of our public opinions, when voters, including gun owners and NRA members, are asked about specific gun control measures, most support these gun control policies for things like background checks and having a database and the capacity in terms of the high capacity assault weapons. Of course, when individuals are asked more broadly about whether it's more important to control gun ownership or to protect the right of Americans in general to own guns, still a favor protecting the right to own guns. And you see this heavily falling along political lines here and shifting to be even more highly politicized. And we see that opposition to gun control largely comes from Republican legislators, gun rights, and gun rights activists, with the National Rifle Association, of course, spending over $30 million supporting President Trump, who campaigned on a pro-gun platform, among many other agenda items, vowing, "I will get rid of gun-free zones in schools." And we see that Republican-controlled legislatures have achieved numerous victories now in rolling back gun control and passing laws favoring gun owners' access to firearms and accessibility to open carry. And in terms of trends, we see that even following mass shootings are a point in time when we have a very large number of gun bills introduced into law, and that even following mass shootings that we see many more laws being passed that loosen restrictions and that permit greater access to guns. And the idea of guns everywhere laws, concealed carry, open carry, stand your ground, all of this is the trend that we're seeing. In terms of recent political battles, there are many. I'll mention one here with an Indiana bill that would allow domestic violence protection order recipients to obtain a firearm without a license, background check, or training. This is something that's been discussed in the news recently. The initial version of this bill, Indiana legislators also tried to give a free gun to everyone who obtained a domestic violence protection order at the taxpayer expense. This is something that the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence opposed, not to be surprised to this group. This is similar to Governor Chris Christie's recent veto of gun control measures regarding domestic abusers restrictions, instead proposing to expedite abuse victims' access to firearms. And what we see is that there are basically well-known risk factors, and there's research showing that certain policies are particularly effective, such as having universal background checks, and so any of the private sales would receive these background checks. Having a national registry. Right now, unlike motor vehicle registration and licensing for drivers, firearm purchases are prohibited from being recorded in a national database. And so if somebody is subject to a firearm ban, it's really very hard to enforce that. And then some different gaps with the Violence Against Women Act, which prohibits purchase, but not, or it prohibits possession but not purchase. I was suggesting reforms here. Expanding that to include ex parte orders is another option, and thinking more about the enforcement side, because right now, most states rely on the honor system for abusers to surrender their guns if they are subject to an enforcement ban. The majority of Americans, in terms of our congressional constituents, when we think about it from that perspective, support these data-driven safety measures. And lawmakers, I think, should have the courage to take direction from their constituents and not from the NRA. Too often our legislators are offering prayers and moments of silence, but their silence regarding gun safety reforms is deadly. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just curious, you've been sitting here all day. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about you and the audience, because I want to know, who am I speaking to and how should I pitch it to you, what I'm about to say. So I'm just curious, how many of you are academics in academia, so majority? How many folks are graduate students or students of some sort? So probably runner-up number 2. And how many folks, and this is free CLE, so I think there should be lawyers here as well, practicing lawyers who want that free CLE. How many folks here are lawyers from the community? Where are you from? Both of, where? Lake Forest. I'm retired. You're retired? And I work for LAPD. Good, so we have, I'm glad we have somebody with, gotta have a little law enforcement representation here as well. That's great. So we have this rich expertise. And anybody else practicing lawyers? Only 2? Oh, wow. Okay. Well, then a lot of the data I'm gonna give you. Okay, well, so this talk is about preventing ordinary and extraordinary violence. It's gonna be a chapter in the book. Where's the book coming out? I'm curious. Oh, excellent. Oh, that's great for all the folks contributing chapters, we were wondering. So this is actually an article that I wrote, and it's updated with data, and sadly, it's actually all the more timely. It's not a good thing when you, it's usually a good thing when your article is still timely years later, but sadly, given the topic, it's not. It's a tragedy. But it's about preventing ordinary and extraordinary violence. What do I mean by that? Well, let me just tie it to one of my current projects now, because this is about the politicization of safety. And right now I'm writing a book about an ethnography about the paradigmatic silencing of science, which is a huge issue that we're seeing in our times, but it's not at all unprecedented, of course. And probably the paradigmatic silencing of science is in the firearms research context, in the public health context. It's interesting that a lot of the academics here are saying, let's do a public health model. These are really, and that's great, that's great. Let's draw on the data from public health. But you know, the very folks whose work actually many of you are citing over and over again that found that having a gun in the home is not something that actually helps you protect your family. Actually, you're more likely to kill your family. Your family's more likely to commit suicide with that gun. That actually having a gun in the home dramatically elevates your risk of death in general, and it's even more elevated with domestic violence. Well, those pioneering researchers who found those important facts have been the target of concerted campaigns to be silenced. Some of them have been drummed out of their field. Why? By the denial of grants, by the denial of funding, and particularly public health, particularly medicine. I mean, the lifeblood of that research is federal grants. You take away that federal grant, you take away a job, because many of them don't have tenure. And or they have to migrate to something which is more money-rich, so money-rich fields are like, relatively speaking, cancer or Alzheimer's now. So you're actually steering with money the zones of knowledge that we have and zones of ignorance, and the ignorance is deliberately maintained. So that's my current project in ethnography with a lot of the, how the resilience in the field, despite these political pressures, but also the costs. The fact that we have a data desert, the fact that people can say the science is not good because you didn't do XYZ type of study, when you can't do the XYZ type of study because you're deliberately deprived of funding and of data. So that's my current interest, but I want to connect to why I wrote this piece, because it's been a long-standing interest. You know, I mean, we have so many great ideas out here. But this is this conference about the politicization of safety, and we have to consider the realities of what actually can happen and what actually gets attention and what are wonderful ideas but just get silenced or shoved aside, or and just never, people argue it over and over again, but it never goes anywhere. And so, what draws people's attention, and these days with, violence, in so many areas, and domestic violence, and the drumbeat of violence numbs people to the point where it takes really high horror, salient events to marshal public attention, to marshal attempts at legislation that go somewhere, to get the money, frankly, that it takes to operationalize good ideas. It takes these dramatic, high horror, salient events. And so this piece was trying to tie normalized, naturalized, and therefore, low attention now, relatively speaking, ordinary violence, to showing the connection between that and the eruption of extraordinary violence. And these images, of course, because they're high horror, because they're salient, they're well known to you. Attacks in Orlando, attacks at the nightclub shooting, Boston bombing, the truck ramming after Bastille Day. These antecedents and these were perpetrators well before this extraordinary violence erupted, had engaged in a lot of normalized ordinary violence. Some of they'd already had, some of them had law enforcement encounters and some of them never did. But they had a history of domestic violence, as Jane mentioned, with respect to Omar Mateen, for example. These are families where they had a lot of, where a lot of normalized violence, domestic violence happened and never got any sort of attention, not by law enforcement really, certainly not by the news media with respect to addressing frailties in the system, not until these families' everyday lives of terror erupted into also extraordinary violence, mass killings. These are all cases of mass killings defined, some say 3, some say 4 or more people killed in one incident. These are cases of homicides, suicides, and they don't even get attention. And even after the eruption of this kind of extraordinary violence, you see it maybe in the local news media, because again, it's a form of domestic violence. It's not viewed as something that's, it's just a more extreme form of what's naturalized or normalized. And so I just really wanted to, so this piece is to really show some data to say, hey, if you really want to address the stuff that gets attention, focus on the stuff that gets normalized. Focus on the stuff that gets naturalized. And it's also, it's also just to present data, more recent data, to hit home again and again, because that's what we have to do as academics. We have to combat these popular misconceptions, mythologies that prevent progress. And one of the biggest ones is, of course, having a gun protects you or family in the home rather than actually ends up with people in the home dying. And so I'm just going to start with some data. This is from the National Violent Death Reporting System. It's an excellent source of data, really important source of progress in information, because it gives you, it gathers information from coroner's reports, from medical investigators' reports, from labs, and it gives you a rich source of information to understand the context in which violence arises, the history of the perpetrators, because to understand from a public health perspective, to understand the context is the first step to actually designing evidence-based preventative strategies. So these are just to show you again that people often, the paradigmatic case in firearms legislation, the fear-filled case is a stranger hunting in public, a homicidal, suicidal stranger, but actually in reality, stranger. When it comes to firearms homicides, it's much more likely to be at the hands of someone you know, an intimate, a friend, a relative, a family member. It's much more likely to happen in your home. These are based, by the way, it's not nationally representative, but it's getting there over time. From the states contributing data, it's much more likely to happen in the home than in public, firearms homicides. And then just to make the connection with one form of extraordinary violence, homicidal, suicidal violence, where you're actually going to be more likely to see the mass killings that seize public attention. The NVDRS, this data set, allows you to drill down into the characteristics surrounding the perpetrators. What were some of the red flags that we could have caught that could have prevented these high horror events? And what I want to show you is that in the next slides, which is with respect to homicide, suicides, which are more likely to be mass killings, which are more likely to seize public attention, the prevalence of having in the past history a reported intimate partner problem of some sort, the highest risk factor, one of the highest risk factors, between 81% and 69% of these perpetrators over the years have had some sort of intimate partner problem. In contrast, financial problems, school problems, job problems, physical health problems are actually much, much lower of a factor in these cases. What I want to show you, what I want to end with is, in my 1 minute, okay. What I'm going to end with is the notion of many of them have had a past history of interpersonal violence. Look at the high numbers between 85% and 53%, and yet contrast that with the legal system contacts. We have laws that try to protect by saying if you have a domestic violence misdemeanor, if you have an outstanding protection order, permanent protection order, you can't have guns. But the reality is that a lot of these, if you have to wait till a legal system gets activated, you're going to miss a lot of the people who pose the biggest dangers. And people often say the paradigm is mental health problems, but very low prevalence in the reported mental health problems. And so I wanted to show you that, and I wanted to end in 30 seconds with actually the remedy, which is why I'm glad we have law enforcement expertise. Lay made a good case about the challenges of relying on law enforcement, but I want to suggest to you that in the reality that we have, law enforcement is probably one of the few actors that actually get called to the scene, and the question is what they do. And so we've had some great comments about the carceral state and the expansion of the carceral state and the pathologies of the system, but what I want to suggest to you is in a political reality where where legislation with respect to firearms regulation is not passing. It's just not passing, not back then and now more than ever. Really focusing on law enforcement discretion, what I call scene of the assault procedure. Focusing on the capacity of law enforcement, not just with respect to criminal law enforcement, but with respect to wearing the public safety, public health hat and developing that capacity, such as counseling with respect to protection orders, such as matching people to social services providers, such as having social services providers responding at the scene of the assault. Like we see perhaps in the addiction context in places like Seattle, for example. We actually have trained, public health trained folks respond. I mean, that is actually what you can do with respect to the laws that exist now, the powers that exist now, notwithstanding the roadblocks with respect to legislation.
Good afternoon. I'm sort of a last-minute addition to this conference, but I'm thrilled to be here, not only because of the very important subject matter, but also because I graduated from the University of California, Irvine, and it's wonderful to come back. The campus is not very recognizable to me because it's grown so much. There was not a law school, for example, when I was an undergraduate here, so I went up north to Stanford to law school. But it's been really wonderful to come back, and I just want to share a draft paper that I'm working on. It's going to be published as a law review article, not as part of the book. And for those of you who've had a chance to check it out on the Dropbox, it is still pretty long. So because we have very limited time this afternoon, I'm just going to be hitting some of the major points of my argument. Like Jane's chapter, my paper critiques gun rights rhetoric, in particular what I call the self-defending woman image propagated by the National Rifle Association, other pro-gun organizations, and gun sellers. And I particularly call this rhetoric out for ignoring the complexity of intimate partner violence, which Professor Fan has shown is one of really the primary type of violence with guns that affects women. For ignoring the fact, for example, that you may not want to just shoot your offender because the offender is your husband. And also for ignoring social factors, particularly gendered hierarchies and social inequalities that produce gun violence. But I also argue in the paper that many advocates of gun control in the context of intimate partner abuse rely on a stereotype of the helpless female victim who needs state protection, including the confiscation of her partner's guns, a stereotype which I believe is also problematic. 2 federal gun control laws, 18 U.S.C. 922G8, which prohibits the possession of firearms that have traveled in interstate commerce by respondents to domestic violence protection orders, and Section 922G9, which applies to domestic violence misdemeanors, derive from the binary of the helpless victim who is always cast as female and the inevitably homicidal male offender who possesses firearms. So in addition to critiquing the gun rights side, my paper confronts some of the costs of potentially ratcheting up the scope and enforcement of firearms bans and the punishment of offenders in response to the relatively lax enforcement that is the current status quo. Given my brief time, I'm going to focus on this critique of the drive for more punitively, rigorously enforced, one-size-fits-all firearms prohibitions instead of my analysis of the manipulation of gender by gun rights activists. I speak from the perspective of an advocate of reasonable gun control. My purpose is not to raise a Second Amendment challenge. In any event, such challenges have been widely defeated in federal court. I raise concerns about women who use force in response to trauma and abuse and are thus subject to misdemeanor domestic violence convictions and attendant gun bans. Some of these women may need guns for self-defense and or for employment, although as Lee points out, as Professor Goodmark points out, only a minority of police officers are women. There are female police officers under 922G9. They're not able to possess their service weapons even if they're subject to a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction. And if the laws and police department policies were rigorously enforced, those females who fought back against batterers, and if they were arrested for that, it's quite often that an offender, the primary offender will call the police and get his victim arrested, that female police officer would lose her service weapon and her job. Abuse victims who don't use force may still not want their batterers' guns confiscated for a variety of reasons, including fear of retaliation and the batterer's loss of employment if he needs his weapon for his job. Unemployment is a primary risk factor for domestic violence, so you can see how there's a certain circularity that may lead to an escalation of violence in confiscating a weapon that the abuser is either very invested in or actually needs for his job. For these and other reasons, some female victims oppose mandatory gun prohibitions connected to misdemeanor arrests, convictions, and domestic violence restraining orders. For example, in United States versus Carter, the defendant had shoved and spit at his girlfriend who cohabited with him. He was arrested, convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor, and he subsequently bought back a rifle that he had taken to a pawn shop. The victim in the case, the girlfriend, said that she was not heard. She didn't want Carter arrested for that initial domestic violence misdemeanor. She didn't want to press charges. She only wanted him removed from the house. In other words, she was using law enforcement instrumentally to interrupt the violence. She didn't desire either the misdemeanor domestic violence conviction or the subsequent federal felony conviction that landed her offender, her partner, in federal prison. It was only for a year. These laws are often underpunished. The typical punishment is in the range of a couple of years, but the federal statute authorizes imprisonment for up to 10 years. So you can see how the rigorous enforcement of these laws might chill reporting by victims who either feared an escalation of violence in response to the confiscation of guns or some kind of socioeconomic impact, or that somehow the involvement of the police would get a weapon that belonged to them confiscated as well. Another big aspect of my paper is to analyze what I call the paradigm of the inevitably homicidal male abuser, which has led the Supreme Court and federal appellate courts, both in statutory interpretation and in cases in response to Second Amendment challenges, to make decisions and use reasoning that entrench the binary of the helpless woman and the inevitably homicidal gun-toting man. In cases like United States versus Boisin and Castleman, the court has extended firearms prohibitions to the door slammer and the plate thrower, who may not be intimate terrorists. They might be women acting in response to a primary abuser, and they might be men who are primary abusers, but whose violence is unlikely to lead to a gun homicide. Misdemeanor offenses under which DV misdemeanors are charged lump together a bunch of disparate conduct. There's a big difference, for example, between non-fatal strangulation, which is obviously extremely serious, but which in Arizona, for example, was only criminalized at the level of a misdemeanor it was only criminalized as a misdemeanor until 2010. And lower level conduct that also is described as a misdemeanor offense, such as, for example, throwing a plate at the wall and having a shard hit and cut your intimate partner. Those are cast as the same kind of offense, although obviously it's quite different conduct in terms of its likelihood of leading to a fatal incident later on. New research on domestic violence suggests that a core of domestic violence offenders are probably incorrigible, very dangerous intimate terrorists, but that not everyone who uses force in an intimate relationship fits that model. In addition to being over-inclusive, federal domestic violence gun prohibitions are under-inclusive because they do not cover non-cohabiting dating violence. We've had several panelists talk about how firearms can be used in dating violence, how can be a very high level of physical and emotional abuse in dating relationships. The federal gun prohibitions don't extend to these kinds of intimate situations, and they don't cover elder abuse, which is predominantly committed by sons and daughters. That's not covered by the federal gun restrictions. As I said, I favor reasonable gun control, and for this reason, the rest of my paper unpacks in some detail the various types of gun prohibitions and enforcement legislation at the state and federal levels, any of which I'd be happy to discuss during Q&A or if we don't have time via email. I assess the differing effectiveness of these approaches in light of empirical studies and my own concern about sparking, or rather just sort of further exacerbating cultural backlash that is inhibiting enforcement of the laws that we have. I'll briefly summarize my conclusions. I think that domestic violence protection order gun restrictions have been shown to be more successful than bans for domestic violence misdemeanors. And importantly, I think they're potentially more respectful of victims' choices. The current problems with enforcement stem, at least in part, from cultural backlash on the part of batterers, police, prosecutors, and judges who view domestic violence gun laws as too harsh. And moreover, I think that in addition to not being enforced enough, the confiscation of the offender's guns, if it does happen, may lull the victim into thinking that she's safe when she's not, if the confiscation triggers the batterer to become more violent. In some cases, I believe that the law's harshness is ineffective, not only because it provokes a refusal to comply, but also because of the cost to abuse victims and their children if the abuser's firearms are actually confiscated. Take the imposition of gun prohibitions on police officers and military personnel, for example. Were these laws vigorously enforced, which they're not, police and military personnel convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence would lose their service weapons and their employment, which has known associations to violent retaliation, and which would have a detrimental economic impact on the victim and her children. For example, even if she separates from her abuser and divorces him, she may need money for child support. Then despite the statistics on recidivism, which are very disheartening, I also argue in the paper that offenders should be treated as potentially redeemable. If for no other reason than I think that if their perception is that the system is unfair, it may drive them further into a violent, misogynistic subculture of guns, which is both precipitating and escalating to their abuse. I just want to talk briefly about two things, and then I'll wrap up here. One, I want to give one example of this unfair treatment of offenders, and that is the potential permanence of Section 922G9, which is the domestic violence misdemeanor gun prohibition. It lasts forever unless the offender is able to get an expungement or a pardon. The ability to expunge a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction varies from state to state. In some states, it's merely a rubber stamp. Hence, more than 1,000 such misdemeanors were expunged in Rhode Island in the first 5 years after the passage of 922G9, the Lautenberg Amendment, there's no evidence really that these expungements resulted after any kind of careful risk assessment of the likelihood of these offenders recidivating, which obviously does not treat the problem of recidivism with sufficient gravity. But in other states, it's pretty much impossible, or it is impossible to get an expungement, which makes the gun ban permanent, regardless of the severity of the triggering misdemeanor, and regardless of whether the offender remains nonviolent for a significant period of time. So I think that you can see this as an example of where an offender may find the restriction overbroad and excessively punitive, and I think my concern here is mainly with how that's going to lead to the ineffectiveness of their prohibitions themselves, and they're not going to have the impact on recidivism that we desire. And I think fair treatment of offenders is important to achieving the results that we want. And the last point that I want to make, I apologize for going a little over here, the last point I discuss in the paper is the potential impact of more rigorous enforcement on vulnerable communities of color. In such communities, ratcheted up domestic violence gun laws might lead to increased surveillance and incarceration of men based on the mere potential to engage in gun violence. They don't have to engage in gun violence to be convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. And in communities of color where there's a lot of use of things like Terry stops to surveil and police the populace, I think that a ramped up version of domestic violence gun prohibitions could have a very detrimental effect. Women of color are also more likely to use force and less likely to seek help from the police than white women. And I think for this reason that sweeping and rigorously enforced surveillance and imprisonment of them for gun possession could have a very detrimental impact, particularly on families in vulnerable communities, such when women are incarcerated, they're oftentimes the primary caregiver, and they're oftentimes incarcerated a very long distance from their children and other family members. I think although these are serious problems, they wouldn't, in my view, be a sufficient reason to avoid rigorous enforcement of DV gun laws if the DV gun laws were finely tuned and showed success in saving lives. But empirical studies dating back to Lawrence Sherman's indicate that mandatory laws may actually increase domestic violence recidivism in poor communities of color. So just very briefly to summarize, my paper argues that we need to acknowledge various interests besides reducing intimate homicide rates. Obviously, we don't want people to die as the result of intimate partner gun violence, but we need to think about victims' interests, their socioeconomic interests, whether or not they actually might be arrested for domestic violence, and sort of move away from this paradigm of the helpless woman who is not arrested and never possesses a gun, and think a little bit more about the complicated reality in crafting more effective and more reasonable gun legislation. Thank you.
Don't worry, I'm using this one, not the lab. Occurs to me, I never actually introduced myself. Sorry, hi. I'm Chris Kahn. I'm an emergency medicine physician and associate professor at UC San Diego. And as the token medical person, I want to say thanks for inviting me. I very much appreciate that. But honestly, I'm really heartened to see, basically every time I come to something that involves so many people outside of medicine, I'm like, oh yeah, this isn't just our problem. This is something that involves a whole lot of folks. We talked about the politicization of safety, and certainly firearms are something that I've always found to be a particular interest of mine, not just because my brother used to lobby for the NRA, long story. He and I have some great discussions, by the way. Then we talked about the Firearm Owners Protection Act in Florida, and how that affected, if I had been in Florida, my ability as a physician to talk to my patients. I believe that was signed in 2011, and it took until 6 weeks ago when the 11th Circuit finally said, never mind that. I'm sure there's a better legal term for that. But we see this outside of firearms as well. We know that political appointees in general will exert control over the presentation, the discussion, even the funding of scientific endeavors. George Bush's, the second, first Surgeon General, Richard Carmona, also a physician, trauma surgeon, he mentioned, strangely, after he was no longer working for that administration, that he had been, and his word was muzzled, talking about embryonic stem cell research. The National Cancer Institute, early in that administration, they actually, despite the lack of a link between abortion and breast cancer, had something on their website, but fortunately only stayed there about 3 months, saying, well, people say both things. And it took a while to get that taken down. So I'm very heartened to see that there are a lot of folks interested from a legal perspective, a medical perspective, a social work perspective, a victim advocacy perspective, so many different approaches to addressing not just the issue of intimate partner violence, but also a much broader issue which I think we've all agreed is related, of politicization of science as it affects safety. And it's something that, although we don't have a lot of time to talk about it now, I would be very happy to expound at length. And unfortunately, I don't think we have time for Q&A for this panel. But
I think we have to transition to our
yep,
next panel.
we are going to go on to our next panel. So thank you very much to all of our speakers.